had the pleasure of learning from Jerome at the school that I teach at, an MCPS school, where he came back when we were allowed to see people in person. And it was just a really memorable morning. So I asked Jerome to come share his story with us. And I'm excited he's here. Jerome is a motivational speaker and author and youth influencer from Charleston, South Carolina. And he is the co-founder and CEO of SmallTalk, a youth speakers bureau dedicated to the mission of youth motivating youth. His passion to inspire has led Jerome to mentor hundreds of students and deliver his impactful message to thousands more. And we're really excited for you to be here.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Yep, Chucktown. Stephanie know about Chucktown. She must be from there. But anyways, that I just love the Charleston love every time. Thank you all so much. I just want to just really also start off by saying how much it means to me that you all are showing up here on a Saturday. I know this is something that y'all do on a regular basis, but hat goes off. I really appreciate it. As Amy mentioned, my name is Jerome. I started this thing called SmallTalk, which is really my side hustle, if you will. How I describe it, SmallTalk is in the business of elevating student stories. But my full-time gig is being the program manager for the Pivotal Network, which is this new initiative coming out of Georgetown. And our goal is to create a support network for high school teachers who we've identified as supporting first-generation and low-income students disproportionately so through the college application process. So it's a really exciting initiative coming out of our hub for equity and innovation at the university. And so I'm just really honored to lead that initiative. So that's what I do in my full-time gig. But as I mentioned, personally, my passion is this notion of elevating student stories. How I say it is I'm in the business of trying to help students understand and articulate their stories to themselves. And then how can I help teachers, and in this case, parents as well, deeply hear those stories and create deeper connections on the basis of them. I emphasize stories, especially when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that talking about race, I know that talking about socioeconomic status, I know that talking about religion and so on and so forth can be very difficult for folks. But we can share stories, and then with deep analytical skills, we can kind of break down where those stories may differ. But we also can see where those stories align. And I think that creates much deeper connections down the long run. So that's my passion. Super excited. Glad that Amy brought me here. Rock Creek has become, my extended family. Done some virtual visits with them. I love that place. And then today, I really just wanted to break down this notion and what I mean by curious parenting. And I think that it's an idea, it's a novel idea. Full disclaimer, I'm not a parent, but I think it's one worth exploring. And today I just really want to share my story and what I've seen and what I've experienced and how I've been able to connect with students through curiosity and really just open up a dialogue for us to think about ways that we can do the same as parents, as educators, and just as adults. So with that, when I say curious parent, I'm talking about a parent who has a genuine selfless interest in knowing how their child is coming to know and understand the world. And they use empathy and vulnerability as a foundation for that inquiry. But you all are here on a Saturday trying to learn and trying to grow. So I don't think I need to hit that over the head too much, because you all are clearly embodying that notion. But just really quickly, I wanted to give a bit of a backstory around SmallTalk as a company and SmallTalk as the book that I wrote and where that mission came from. So as I said, I'm in this mission of helping students understand their stories and then helping adults deeply hear those stories and make those connections. For me, the reason why, and I actually just gave a talk a few nights ago to a group of entrepreneurial students at Georgetown, and I was telling them about there's the entrepreneur who's driven by the hustle and they like making money and they like flipping a business. If it's good, if it's scalable, they're with it, right? But then there's an entrepreneur who uses their passion and their identities to drive the work that they do. And I think I'm a little bit more of the latter. I realized the power of understanding my own story when I was a freshman in college. And though I was kind of the good student and I was at Georgetown and all these different things, it didn't really hit home to me. And I really understood the world, that I recognized that so many of our young people, so many people aren't coming to grasp with this realization. I think that leads to things that we see in our society today. People who are being radicalized and aren't independent thinkers because they haven't been given that space to try to understand their world organically. So all that being said, that power of self-knowledge is real. I feel it, I believe it. And that's what drives SmallTalk and my mission. And just to kind of give you a little bit more backstory of who I am, I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. I was raised by my grandparents because my parents weren't in the picture. My mother specifically was in and out of jail. She would write fraudulent checks. She was a young mother. She had me as a teenager. I always saw her committing crimes as a way of trying to figure life out. But that being said, I was raised by my grandparents. My grandparents just racially break down. My grandfather is African-American. My grandmother is white. So my mom is mixed. But they raised me in a very loving household until I was about 14 years old. My grandfather actually left. He left my grandmother, and it was just my grandmother taking care of me, my two siblings. She was doing 2 jobs, and she was going back to school. And so it put a lot of stress on our household when I was about 14. And then I would say that left me without a curious parent in my home for my most formative years. My grandfather was definitely my father figure, and was definitely the curious one and taught me a lot. And I just don't think my grandmother had the capacity, both emotionally and through time, to be that curious parent for me. And I think that left me to figure out some things on my own. And looking back on it, I would have much benefited had I had a curious parent or a curious adult in my life. And I'll tell a little bit more about that story down the road. But I will say that these things and who I was and who I was trying to be was mostly being told to me in high school, right? I had like this one side of me that was obviously, kind of like, I love being a businessman. I did this nonprofit as a kid. I was a youth entrepreneur for South Carolina. I loved public speaking. I was the ambassador for the school, AP student, you name it. And then on the second side, I was just trying to figure out what it's like to be a young Black kid living in, borderline poverty. If you're anybody who knows about Charleston, we're home of the Gullah Geechee culture. I'm trying to figure out what that identity of Blackness means to me, not as explicitly, but definitely implicitly, trying to figure out what it means to be loyal to my friends. And even though I'm over here and they're over here, how do I kind of see myself as an equal, and try to figure out what it means to be cool, right? What it means to be the cool kid. And I'll tell them more about these stories, but I think these identities that I truly embodied as a high school student weren't necessarily my own. They were what I was told to be, either directly or implicitly through society. And so with that, I tried to be both of these identities. And I thought that's who I was. And then I got accepted to Georgetown. And then I got to Georgetown University, this ivory tower, full financial aid ride. Like, this was a place that I just truly felt I wasn't supposed to be at statistically. And then that's when I got hit with a whirlwind of realities. I was struck first with the juxtaposition of me being at Georgetown University, which I always kind of saw myself as like, I deserve to go out of state. I was shooting for the best business schools, whatever. But as soon as I got there, I recognized that I was an anomaly. I was deemed as the exception. And that just crushed my spirit, because I had my friends who were just as savvy and witty, and if applied in the right way, could have thrived at a Georgetown. I mean, it's a tough school to get into, but that's just numbers. It wasn't that hard. And then I started to feel a sense of survivor's guilt. Why was it that I was able to make it here, and then my friend groups weren't? And that's messed up, that I felt like I survived for just going to college. It's a normal process for most Americans, but not me. And then on top of that, I was trying to figure out this notion of, okay, being Black in this predominantly white space, which I had been before. My school was, very integrated. I was raised by a white woman, so that wasn't the thing. But I still like this notion of being able to connect with the Black community. And then I was ostracized a little bit from them, because I didn't know the certain things that more privileged African-American students had purview to when it related to Black history, Black culture. I didn't know these things, and my Blackness was questioned. So I started questioning myself. And then that exacerbated once I started diving deeply into my heritage and thinking about the systems of oppression that actually led to me. Like, you learn about systematic racism, and then you're like, oh, shucks. I was in poverty. Oh, shucks. We were on EBT. Oh, shucks. I got this poor public school education that left me without knowing myself. And so that compounded by the fact that I was a marketing major and then learning the true history of capitalism and how my body would have been capital just 400 years ago, I was just conflicted, survivor's guilt, conflicted on why is it that I love marketing? Like, where did that even stem from? Who just loves marketing? Like, is that something to really be passionate about? And then all these things compounded and left me, lack of a better word, enraged. I was furious. I was like, and I wasn't even just mad that I didn't know these things. I was more so mad that I felt like it was purposefully withheld from me. I felt bamboozled. How was I smart enough to get into a school like Georgetown, but I didn't know anything about my identity, politics, the way the world operated, the way the world influenced how I was forced to live, how people where I'm from are forced to live, none of that. And so that anger turned into passion. I started working with young people, and then I did something crazy. I signed up for a class at Georgetown and I wrote a book. The book is called SmallTalk, One Youth, 7 Stories, Countless Lessons. I say it's good for anyone from a freshman in high school to a senior in college, but it was my way of just opening up these dialogue to share authentic stories with the hopes that I could help any other young person not have to feel as though they got hit with a whirlwind of realities all at once. And then that led to me creating this company, this idea of this organization that's meant to help students also recognize their stories and come to that understanding of the world around them like I did, and then helping teachers and parents pull those stories out of them and deeply listen to them. But then as I started that company and I went on and started doing things and speaking to students, I realized that my experience was not uncommon. So many young people felt as though people were hiding the world from them. And it's just this weird duality of feeling like you know nothing when you have access to godlike technology that can tell you everything. And then you're stuck in the middle. It's like, why do I still know nothing? And that's when as I was connecting to more schools and more students, I just learned how pervasive it was. And then something came to my realization. I realized students weren't able to have these conversations because most adults aren't having these conversations with themselves. I talk about love and forgiving my mother. I talk about being vulnerable with myself and with other people. I talk about taking ownership. I talk about, the list goes on. And I thought that was just something just for me and maybe for a few young people, but I just became apparent that it's a much more pervasive issue. And so that's what leads me into the biggest lesson that I took after starting SmallTalk. If I want to truly help more students at scale come to these realizations, then I had to commit to working with the adults that support them. And the most heartbreaking realization that I came to was actually when I had published a book. It was my junior year of college, and I went back home after the school year ended. The academic, the collegiate school year ended, but the high school year was still going. And I did like a book signing at my old high school, and I lined up 5 schools to go and speak as a little book tour around the city. So going to these different schools, my second stop was actually at my old middle school, and my principal, he was the assistant principal when I was there, but he's the principal now. He like dug into me and forced me to talk about these more kind of raw stories that I actually was tiptoeing around. I realized for the first time, like I had written these stories, but I never talked about these stories. So I was like, I got to talk about it. I could tell in the students' faces that they needed to hear this thing. So by the end of that week of me going to share these stories at different schools, I had gotten super vulnerable at this point. And I was like laying it all on the table. I'm starting off from the gut, from the hip, because these are things that students just don't get the chance to hear and actually get the space to talk about. So many students were opening up and coming to me and talking to me afterwards. I was at this high school in Charleston called Hanahan High. And then there's one student came up to me afterwards, and I'm gonna call him Zach. And he stopped up to me, and after I shared my story about my mom and learning to forgive her, he told me his story of trying to forgive someone too. He says, hey, my sister passed away like 2 years ago. And I was like, oh my God, like, I'm so sorry for your loss. Like, how are you dealing with that? He's like, yeah, I'm good, but I'm trying to learn how to forgive the person who killed her. And that just took the wind out of me. I was like, oh my God, like I was not prepared for this conversation. But I tried to like mitigate, and I tried to talk to him, and we were exchange. I gave him my Instagram. I don't know. I was like, we can follow up. And then a teacher comes in and was like, hey, Zach, you know, Miss White is looking for you. You haven't turned in your quiz. And he's like, no, I turned it in yesterday. He's like, nah, she thinks it's missing. You need to go before she gives you a tardy. And just like that, our conversation was cut. Just like that. And I could tell, and then follow up conversations with Zach, because I stayed in touch with him. These teachers knew nothing about what was going on in his life. And I was like, damn, how is that the case? How is it I was only able to talk to him for 30 minutes and he opened up to me in this way? And then that made me think about it. I'm sure that these teachers actually care about them, but they may not have the tools to be curious. They may not have the tools to really listen to Zach and allow him the space to even be able to feel as though he can bring that up, which apparently I kind of just got lucky and opened up the floodgates for. And then that will compound. I mean, I got students, elementary school students were coming to me to talk about forgiving their parents, or learning how to respect their step parents, or dealing with death in their family, or family members who were incarcerated, or finding new passions and trying to figure out their voice. And then every time and time again, these were things that their teachers just knew nothing about. So why would they open up to me in such profound ways after 30 or 45 minutes of ever meeting me? And that's because I think I allowed myself to be a human in front of them and was genuinely curious about what they had to say in response. Some of your kids may not know which shoe goes on the left or the right foot at this age, but they do know what it's like to be humanized. They do know what it's like to be respected. That is an intrinsic human quality that we all share. And so I just want to talk about my own stories of not having curious adults present in my life, and how I think that affected me, and where I think things could have been different. I know what it's like to be the only curious adult in a child's life. Like over the last 3 years, I've become that in so many different students' lives. But I also know what it's like to not have a curious adult when you need one. But of course, you never know that until after the fact, right? That's just the hardship of teenage adolescence. But that being said, I think about my first time of really being seen by a curious adult, and it happened in 5th grade. My class was doing this exercise with a guidance counselor. But that day I kind of wasn't my usual self, and, you know, or at least who I kind of pretended to be. I was always placed on a pedestal, even at an early age. And so after the exercise was done, we were released to go to recess. I was a little slow in leaving, and my class left, and I was the last one to exit the room. And this guidance counselor stopped me. She said, "You don't seem like your usual self today. Like, how are you, Jerome?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." You know what I'm saying? I'm keeping up the usual act. And she says, "You don't have to tell me that you're fine when you're really not. What's going on?" I was like, "I don't know. I've been thinking about my mom." And she says, "Well, why does thinking about your mom make you feel sad?" And I know this seems very simple. And I know we may ask these things of students and they still don't open up. But for me, that was the first time anyone had ever asked that. And then she probed and questioned in a way that I can tell she was genuinely curious, genuinely wanting to help. And then I just found myself completely breaking down. Her name was Miss Smalls, promise, no relation, but she was the first curious adult, I believe, that I ever interacted with. And I was always seen as the good kid. You know, I was always kind of like doing this, good grades, what have you. And I felt like because of that, no one was ever curious about me. I wasn't on their radar. I wasn't a problem. And so in that relationship between me and the adults in my life continued all the way throughout high school. Ta-Nehisi Coates had once wrote, "I was a curious boy, but the schools were not concerned with curiosity. They were concerned with compliance." I always complied. In fact, I excelled. I played the system well, and I was seen as perfect. And that just placed an unbearable amount of stress on me, especially as a teenager when I was still trying to figure myself out. And then that leads me into who I was as a high school, and how I didn't feel as though I had curious educators or curious adults in my life in high school either. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the famous show Hannah Montana. It was like a staple in my childhood. I describe my upbringing in high school as a ghetto Hannah Montana. I had 2 lives, literally. One life, I was in the newspaper Youth Entrepreneur of the Year for South Carolina, student ambassador for my school, did the morning announcement constantly in the local press. And I was giving opening addresses for my mayor, for the mayor of North Charleston and for the mayor of Charleston. In fact, when I was 14, Mayor Keith Sumney proclaimed July 28th as Jerome Smalls Day. Like, that's who I thought I was. That's who I was being told to be over here. But then on the flip side, I was still a kid who was living in poverty, right? I mean, the first time I ever smoked weed was in 8th grade. Actually, ironically enough, on my first college tour trip, we smoked in the bathroom of the hotel that we were in. I was trying to fit in. I was aware that my accolades were exceptional, and I didn't want to be ostracized by the people who I had to hang out with every day. So I tried to make sure that I was seen as normal between the two. I wanted to be cool in both spaces. First time I ever had sex was 14, unprotected, because I didn't know. I genuinely thought that you had to be 16 years old to buy a condom. I don't know where that idea even came from. So that, on top of the fact that I have friends who I grew up with since elementary school who got associated with gang activity, and I just remained their friends. But because of that, opposing gangs thought I was a part of that gang. I would literally give the morning announcement and be walking to AP calculus, and people would threaten to shoot my car after school. I'm like, bro, I'm just a nerd, bro. Like, that's not who I am. So yes, and that's what it was. It was exhausting for me to live these two lives and to be hyper aware of the very different people who I were in these different spaces. And I share all that to say that in many ways, those mistakes I was making were just the learning lessons of adolescence, right? But in a lot of ways, they could have got me arrested. They could have hindered my chance of ever going to Georgetown, or even worse, I could have got killed. And most of this was because I didn't have curious adults checking in on me. And that's when I saw, like, this is how little they knew about the quote unquote good kid, right? And even on the surface, it's still out, straight A student, went to Georgetown, was a good kid, right? But no one pried deeper. No one was curious to know who Jerome actually was. And I think that's what left me so emotionally distraught my freshman year, when those questions of who I actually was started to come to the surface. And so I was realizing, if they don't know this about the good kid, imagine how little people actually know about the bad kids, quote unquote. And so that leads me into this idea of curious teaching. I know it's a long build up here, but this is why, in my opinion, it's so important. And this is why I'm so passionate about it. And this is why I try to embody this curiosity anytime I engage with young people. I know that Tacoma Park Nursery, you clearly value a curious education for your students. I mean, this focus on nature and art and play, all activities that require and ignite curiosity and creativity in your young ones. And so I don't need to further explain the importance of our students being curious. But let me ask you this: how can we ask or expect our students to be curious if we aren't curious ourselves? This is where leading by example for our children must come into play. So again, full disclaimer, I am not a parent, but I will say one of my life goals is to be the father to my children that I never had. And I see myself coming from where I came from and experiencing true social mobility and trying to understand the world that I live in and contextualize it with all of my intersecting identities. I also feel as though everything that I am doing currently is genuinely for my unborn children. So that's something I think about all the time. And I think about how I talk to these students that I interact with and how that's going to translate into my parenting one day. So all that being said, these are the things that I expect to do for myself. And so as parents, the objective should always be to help create, I believe, a better human being than ourselves. And we want to create this human being to be one who is more caring, an independent thinker, more self-aware. And so that logic leads me to say that, therefore, our real goal is to help our children come to know themselves and the world that they live in. Like, how will they ever see the value in their own stories if it seems as though no one else does? I felt as though people always grabbed to the good Jerome, and no one ever worried about who that person actually was, what he actually wanted to be, the duality of the realities that he was experiencing, and so on and so forth. So I never saw value in asking those questions of myself. And that being said, that's where being a curious parent is so important. It's showing your child that their story matters by example of your genuine interest in those stories. And so the question then becomes, how does curious parenting look in practice, right? Like, how do we actually think about this and contextualize this beyond just the abstract? I see curious parents as ones who use their inquisitive nature, not as a tool to be nosy and invasive, but to show true interest and excitement. The three pillars that I would break down curious parenting would be obviously curiosity, having a true eagerness to learn about and from your student. Paulo Freire, a great writer, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, chapter 2 talks about the notion that there is teachers as students and students as teachers. And true education comes when those lines are more blurred than distinct. So curiosity is not just learning about them, but learning from them and being genuinely interested in what this little human being may have to offer you in your existence. The second pillar is vulnerability. There has to be a willingness to break down the barriers to see your student as a whole person. I think, again, this is difficult for most adults to be vulnerable even with themselves, much less with a child, but it's necessary. I mean, Brene Brown talks about this beautifully in her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, but she describes that as the impetus for true human connection. And if we're talking about our children, we're talking about our students, if that's the case, if they are still human, like I said, they know what it's like to be humanized, then that has to be in the remedy as well. And then the third pillar is empathy and being non-judgmental. I don't judge the students that come my way. A part of that is my kindergarten teacher, Miss Crow. She said, I don't believe there's any such thing as a bad student. There's only students who make a bad child. There's only children who make bad decisions. She said that to us. I internalized that as a kindergarten, and that's something that I hold true in my heart. And so with that, I step with empathy. And actually, as a person who was a good kid and did all the same stuff as the bad kids, there's so much empathy that I have for whenever students are making mistakes and being labeled as X, Y, or Z. And that comes off. And that's why they're willing to share with me. That's why they're willing to open up, because they know that I'm not trying to cast judgment. I'm truly trying to understand why you led to this decision point and help you understand why you led to this decision point. So those are the three pillars to being a curious parent in practice, in my opinion: curiosity, vulnerability, and then empathy and non-judgmental. And so in closing, by being curious about who your children are, they then see the value and understand the true importance of being curious about themselves. And that's how I think we raise the next generation of truly independent thinkers. That's how we create people who are caring and empathetic, and should I say, curious about others. So that's my spiel. That's my story. I hope that missed something, hope that stuck, hope that resonated. And really, I would just love just to open up a dialogue and let's talk about this. Let's take this from the abstract and see how have you been curious parents and teachers with your students? What have worked, what hasn't worked, and maybe even use some of this time to collaborate on ways that we can improve upon that. But thank you so much. Also happy to answer any questions or to spark a dialogue. I do want to just highlight, and Amy kind of share some news about just the co-op program that you all do with parents in the classroom. I was just really moved by that. I think that's a perfect embodiment of parents as curious parents in their children's education. I would love to actually just learn more about that and to hear from you all, like some successes and how that works in practice.
I'll say one of the things that we hold one. I'm not going to answer that question exactly. I think it'd be cool to hear from a parent, but this year, because of COVID, we don't have parents in the classroom, and it's really painful. So, but one of the things that we do try to communicate is that story holds power. It holds value. So we shape the children's play in terms of story. We shape the stories that we tell and the stories that we share. But what I'm hearing and is resonating with me today is taking the time to listen. So it's like, and to get past assumptions. Like, you can't look at someone and say, everything's working, let me move on to the where it's not working, or what, and it's the assumptions of what I think is working, right? Like, so I have to get past those assumptions, and then so giving the space and the time for someone to offer their story and just to listen. Just that. And that's the two things that, like, you know, from your, thank goodness your fifth grade teacher, Ms. Smalls, was ready to do that. But also it's because you obviously have a strength of story. So it's like, you know, that stories communicate so much, but that space to listen, man, that is just, it's something that I'm going to take to school on Monday. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to take it to school on Monday, because then I can think about, like, am I giving that space? Am I making assumptions? So that's one of the pieces that I'm getting.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, and this is a challenge for me too, like constantly, especially when I'm working with younger students, is figuring out, okay, I know that they have something to share, but they don't have the language to share it. So how do I facilitate and create the structure that pulls it out of them and plants just enough seeds so that way they can communicate in the mode that best fits them. And so that's always a challenge, right? Like that's putting this into practice that is difficult, that takes some creativity, that takes some trial and error. But yeah, so.
And you know, and the thing is that I think I don't want to, I'll jump out of this in a minute, but because this resonates with me, is that I think it takes space. And so one of the things that we're thinking about all the time is giving space. And you can see that I just jumped right in to start talking, right? And I think that, like, this idea that observation and time and like you said, planting seeds so that they know you are a person that once that space is given and shaped, they can walk into it. So yeah.
I'll jump in. I love, Jerome, that you said, that you say, like, it's a story, like, just tell me your story. That seems so less, like, it doesn't seem as overwhelming. It seems more like inviting, like, yeah, just like, tell me your story. I love how you phrased that.
And I would say, I didn't even know that was, and also, Heidi, thank you so much. That was such a sweet thing to say in the chat. I really appreciate that, truly.
It's true, you will be. We're all here to say that. All of us, everybody's going to shake their head. Yes, you will be a wonderful father. Not to worry.
That's much love. That's much love. Yeah, I got a lot of friends who have kids right now, and they're like freaking out. I was like, hey man, all you gotta do is feed them and love them. Like, at the end of the day, make sure they don't die and feel love. And so it's not that hard. I'm just playing. But no, to your point though, 100%. And I actually didn't know that's what all it was until what happened was I would just share mine. And going to planting seeds, it set the precedence, right? Because that's why I do vulnerability off the cuff now. I just start off the gates. I got 30 minutes to share some stuff. I'm gonna just get to it. Because as the authoritative figure coming into the space, I just completely reset the tone. And it's like, oh, we can talk about that here? Oh, snap. Like, I'll be in front of some high schoolers and talk about how I had sex for the first time at 14 and thought I was about to be a dad at 14, which would have made me a bad father at that point. I would not have been as good. But that being said, though, I say that, and it's like, and especially when going to like these low income schools, like, we don't talk about this with our kids, right? Especially conservative values in Charleston, South Carolina, sex is a taboo, this and that, but everybody getting pregnant. So depending on where I'm at, depending on where I know the pain points are for the demographic of students, let's talk about it. Let's open up the floodgates. And what I realize is, in response, that's how you get these stories, right? And the same thing happens. So there's actually a teacher here in Charleston who uses my book to satisfy one of the writing requirements standards, which is the personal narrative essays. First year she was teaching, stories would be just kind of like whatever, right? Some might dive into it a little bit. Some might talk about the story when their iPhone broke. But then she used my book and had them analyze my stories that I share in this book. And she's told me, like, night and day, their stories have just gotten much more personal, much more reflective and introspective. And I won't say that like I told anybody to do that, but I think it just reframed what's possible, opened up the mind to think about, oh, actually, that did happen when I was 10. That really played a role in how I think right now. Um, and until you hear somebody kind of going through that thought process in front of you, you don't know, you don't have the muscles to do it yourself. So yeah, 100%. And so then once those muscles are formulated, then it just becomes, okay, let me tell me a story. Tell me a story. Like I just started therapy this year. And I feel like if I started 2 years ago, it would have been a much longer process before I got into the point of just being able to talk. I just talk now to complete strangers all the time, and it's liberating. And so like those muscles are formulated now. So
Jerome, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay, by the way? I'm
yeah.
paranoid about it. My name is Brian. I teach in DC public schools at the high school level. And so what you're saying is really resonating. And I was reminded of a meeting that we were having the other day, a faculty and staff meeting, where we were doing some training around equity, and we were putting together a equity code of conduct. And one of the points was about harm and repair. And there was some language around that. And then during the discussion, one of my colleagues said, I would change the language of that from an if to a when. The language of if there's harm, then there needs to be repair assumes that there is possible that there won't be.
Right.
And so thinking of it in terms of the inevitability that we will cause harm to each other and need repair is a step toward vulnerability and storytelling rather than perfectionism, judgment, and all the things that prevent us from opening up. So that was just something that I was reminded of while you were speaking.
I appreciate you sharing that too, because it makes me also think about, because my true end goal with this work and any student I come into is like, I just want you to just think for yourself. Like, I look at the polarization that we see. I look at the influence. If anybody's seen The Social Dilemma, it's incredible. And suicide is up, particularly amongst young girls, but amongst youth and as a whole, because in this dialectic moment of their lives, when they're trying to figure out who they are, there are just overstimulation telling them who they should be. And so it's easy to become radicalized. It's easy to become something that you're not, or to think that this is the reality of the world, and it's not. So the end goal is self-awareness. The end goal is independent thinking. And so with that being said, to your point, Brian, it's understanding that we will cause harm. Like, that's just a thing that humans do. Understanding that I had to realize, like, even though like everybody puts me a lot of people put me on this pedestal. And so how do I take myself off that pedestal was like a big journey that I had to learn, right? But with that, I had to realize that, yeah, I'm a nice guy, this and that, I'm outgoing, but I'm still the villain in somebody's story. I'm the villain in a few people's story. And that's just part of the human experience. And so I think, yeah, like it's all about, and it sounds overly simple, but I feel like it's just so much humanity being lost in how we talk and how we do things. And that's driven through capitalism. That's driven through productivity. That's driven through all these things. Capitalism is what, 400 years old? We've been humans for millions of years. Like, there's this basicness that we need to establish and return to, that I just think gets overlooked. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And Stephanie, to your point in the chat, I haven't done any work explicitly with administrators. I think, so I was a business guy in college, and I started SmallTalk as a startup my junior year. And I did like this starter program, this startup launch program over the summer with Georgetown. So part of what we had to do was a lot of customer discovery. And so I was thinking about my work with students. I think my work with students is tangible. There is impact. I can measure it. I can talk about it, and I can stand confidently on it. On the flip side, I was doing a lot of customer discovery, and with the teachers that I work with for my 9 to 5, that paired with what I was doing before, I just learned that most PD lackluster across the board. In fact, our teachers from the Pivotal Network call PD what they call it. I think professional detention was how they rephrased it. All that being said, though, I recognize that because capitalism, because we're driven by numbers, oftentimes to do work with administrators, you gotta be able to stand by some type of objectivity and tangibleness and metrics that I haven't really formulated with my ideas and their implementation yet. So I haven't done any explicit work with administrators in that regard. But I have always been open to do conversations and start dialogues. And that's something that I do feel comfortable with doing. But I will say, though, not through SmallTalk, but through my 9 to 5, the Pivotal Network, through Georgetown's initiative. It's a research-based organization. We're doing incredible research around the impact of students, the impact on students by teachers and their administrators. We actually partner with the Crystal Ray Network, which is a nationwide network of Jesuit high schools that are going to work with us to think on the administrative level as it relates to undermatching, so helping first-gen low-income students get to the right college. But I plan to take a lot of those learnings and bring it back to SmallTalk in similar ways too.
I'd love to ask a question if I could. Hi, my name is Kate, and feeling a little vulnerable. For your story hitting so many, I think, probably all our hearts in some way. And so just really acknowledging that. So I've got a 5-year-old and a 9.5-year-old, almost 10, and since COVID, and I think since my son has turned 5, and since he also goes to the Purple School, which, Leslie and Ada really facilitate the humanizing of children, right? So the kids aren't talked down to, they're really taught to, at least I observed in cooperative, is, just really how to relate to each other and what your words, say and mean and all of that space. Anyway, so since Otis has been 5 and my daughter has been 9.5 during COVID, we've been having family meetings on Saturday mornings, and it's been phenomenal. I mean, it's been really hard and lots of vulnerability, and we have this little template, and we bring up words like last week we talked about empathy. The week before we talked about bias, and I think today we'll talk about curiosity. I think it would just be a really great one to talk about. But what I'm struggling with in my own parenting, and I definitely, I grew up with a military father, and yeah, just compliancy, and that's just so drilled in capitalism, right? We're just educated to become soldiers. And so in the moment, right, what I want, I know, shit's going down. There's upset, and I'm triggered, my child's triggered. I see that, and intellectually I'm thinking I want to be curious, but I can't find the catchphrase or the thing that will open that up, right? That will create the space to have that really vulnerable conversation. And I guess that's, sorry, long question short is, do you have any little mantras or catchphrases that, are just kind of easy to, I wrote down this one that your teacher said, you don't have to say you're fine when you're not. That's just so powerful. But anyway, that's my.
I think that's a great question.
Thank you.
Great question, Kate. And for me, so it's kind of like a quick story about Gandhi, right? Story about Gandhi. There was this mother who had a child who kept eating candy, and she asked the child to stop eating candy, and he wouldn't. But the child really respected Gandhi. So the mother goes to Gandhi and says, "Hey, Gandhi, can you tell my son to stop eating candy?" He says, "Okay, come back in a week." She comes back in a week. He tells the boy, "Stop eating candy." The boy stops eating candy. After the boy leaves, she comes up to Gandhi like, "Hey, thank you so much, but why did I have to wait a week?" And Gandhi says, "I had to stop eating candy before I could tell your son to stop eating candy." And my friend told me that my freshman year of college. And that is like, that embodies like how I try to go about things, right? Like I started therapy this year because I have seen through my friends the power of therapy. I have friends who are therapists, right? And I haven't gone to therapy. So I was like, I can't be out here telling people to go to therapy if I don't go to therapy. And the same thing with being vulnerable. Like, I can't be out here telling people to be vulnerable, but I'm not vulnerable. I can't. And so with that, I think it definitely starts with the self. So like, I see everything as an opportunity to learn more about humanity. For instance, you talk about like the catchphrases. I'm watching Sopranos right now, and like Tony Soprano would like get these like kind of like zingers from his therapist, and then you see like episode 2 down the road, he like uses it. He's like, you like the bird and the duck, and that is like, you see that he's pulling from this source and trying to use it over here. And that's just what I do. I constantly use it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, everything is an opportunity to be repurposed. I'm a firm believer in R&D, rip off and do better. I mean, nothing's really original. So all that being said, I think that has become like, that staple has become my focus, and that allows me to like repurpose things and to find those ways of opening up. And I will say, like, me being able to do this right now is like 3 years after I started this journey, you know what I'm saying, when I first published the book. Like, I would not have been able to go in front of a group of parents, of adults, and just open up like this and be myself. Like, I would have came in with much more prescribed, trying to, you know, the zingers, right? Like, now no opportunities wasted, or, you know what I'm saying, each one teach one, whatever the hell. Like, you know what I'm saying? I'm yeah, some cliches I hold on to because they're good, but some things are just corny. Some things are just, you can tell that, I don't know, people have heard them so much they lost their weight. And so my thing is like, how do I just say what I got to say? And I think that level of vulnerability, level of authenticity opens up the floodgates for students to be like, yeah, okay, cool. I can just say some stuff. Cool. Going back to capitalism and performance and being productive, there's a level of professionalism that we always feel as though we have to like subscribe to. And so then that becomes with perfectionism and saying that, oh, I can't say this idea until I figured out how I want to say it. And it's like, yeah, no, that becomes very difficult. Like, most, especially for children, they're not going to be able to have that level of language anytime soon. So how do we kind of model that as well?
Yeah, maybe in the moment I can just be like, yeah, I really want to be curious right now, you know, or something like that.
But then it goes to like flexing the muscles too, though, right? Like, you'll be surprised. Like, you have so much in your repertoire, like, or in your Rolodex. Like, there's so much in there. It's a matter of like knowing the cues and flexing the right muscles to pull it out. And that's what I've just gotten back. Like, the last 3 years has just been like kind of trial and error. Like, oh snap, actually that's a pretty dope story. Or like, that makes sense here. Like, oh, I never thought about using this in this context. And that's like the beauty of like intersectionality in its truest form. And like, we talk about all cross-disciplinary, right? Like, we talk about this all the time. Like, right, what does it look like to have English and math? Because people learn better that way. Same thing. Like, I'm talking about the Sopranos on a Saturday morning with a group of parents from you know what I'm saying, Maryland. Like, who does that? I don't know. I was watching Sopranos last night. That's why I'm talking about it now. And so like, that type of like spontaneity and realizing like, yeah, there's something to pull from everything, especially like a show like The Sopranos. Like, it's well written. It's meant to kind of capture the human experience in a really interesting way. So ooh, Kate, with the being called out, I feel it. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I'll just say that there's nothing like parenting to teach you, you know, and this year has taught me that, like, here I go recreating cycles that I experienced. And this lovely child luckily has a kind of shout from the rooftops style that I did not have as the kid who didn't get, checked on. So she's letting me know that it's not working, and we're gonna be curious about that and figure it out. So thank you for sharing.
Love that. I love that.
You mentioned Gullah, and I'm looking for my, there was a book I read like 20 years ago. Was it Caucasia? Nope, not Caucasia. I'm gonna find it.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Gullah is a language from African descent mixed with English that's only found in the low country region of South Carolina and a bit of Savannah, Georgia. Geechee is more so the dialect that has kind of morphed out of it. And that was also part of my learning experience too. Like Blackness in Charleston more or less is pretty monolithic. And so me going to a school like Georgetown and meeting Africans and Afro-Latinas and Afro-Caribbeans and Jamaicans and so on and so forth, it's just Black folk from different parts of the country, really just kind of, that was like my first introduction, like, oh, this world is big. Like it's very diverse, even just in the Black diaspora, much less like every other space. So yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have two boys who are alumni from the Purple School, and I'd say Leslie kind of introduced us to being curious parents early on and kind of being present, completely present. I think what our challenge is now is puberty, and my kids don't want me to be present. So sometimes I'm trying really hard to listen and ask questions and like, get away, leave me alone, and trying to be creative to kind of still want to be. Sometimes I don't want to after a while. You're like, okay, I'll go away, but trying to be persistent. I think that's our challenge right now for a 12 going on 15, I feel like he's in the midst of his teenage years, but he's still 12.
Yeah.
You feel it.
100%. And I think, and that's why that's why also I broadened it, because that's how I was too, right? Like even if my grandma had the space to be more curious, I probably wouldn't have been that receptive, right? And that's where, and I say I didn't have curious adults, but I definitely did, because they kept me enough on the straight and narrow to recognize that there's value in this, there's value in, writing this paper, there's value in college. People told me that I was going to college, and people really poured into me in that way. And so I think about curious parenting, or just being a curious adult, very broadly, right? Because there's also immense power that you can play in someone else's child's life, right? Of being just that added outside force. And that's the role, that's where I live at. That's the groove I live at as someone who comes into different schools and circumstances and just can kind of like come in, drop the mic and leave. And I'm like, you've been saying that all along, but then when he said it, it makes sense now. Like, and that's, I don't know what that is. I haven't done enough study into the adolescent mind to figure out why that is what it is, but there's just too much familiarity with you, right? Like, okay, mom. And I think that's where we talk about it takes a village. And I think that's where, if we really embody this notion of being curious parents to our own children, and what does that look like to extend that to the other young people in our lives, whether it is through blood or classmates of our students or so on and so forth. I'm curious to see what that impact could look like at scale.
Hi, Lisa. It's so good to see you.
And Heidi, I'll definitely check out Daughters of the Dust. That sounds fascinating.
It's not like the book on it. I just remember I read it like 20 years ago and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for hearing me out, and for the incredible kind words in the chat and the questions in the dialogue. I mean, that's one thing that I always just try to do, is like, how can we spark a dialogue? So happy to keep conversations going. Amy has my contact information, and really look forward to seeing what you all accomplish with your students, and best of luck. I know this times are hard. For everyone who's also a teacher, I got 25 teachers that we work with for our program, the Pivotal Network. And it's just, y'all, and just overlooked, to say the least. I mean, I had educators who were getting one message from the state, a different message from the district, a different message from their local school, and then dealing with students with the cameras off and students not applying at the same rate, students who they know are vulnerable to not going to schools that they have a good chance to go to, not asking them to write letters of recommendation, plus their own mental health of being parents and humans living in a pandemic. So anyways, hat goes off to all of you as parents and as teachers. If anybody is looking out for you, I want to say somebody over here is, and I just want to say thank you for giving me an hour of your time on a Saturday.
Thank you so much, Jerome. I was busy scribbling my own notes and just really trying to think. I have some kids that don't really like to talk that much. So I think my big takeaway is if I keep talking and being vulnerable, I think I'm hanging on to those stories of kids that after just 30 minutes of listening to you were able to find you to be a safe place to.
And it's also understanding a different community. My little brother doesn't like to talk that much. And until I came home this year, we hadn't really established a relationship. And like through him, I've been learning, kind of like putting my own, you know what I'm saying, preaching into practice. And he's musically inclined. And so I just stopped listening to his music. And we talk about music. We talk about Marvel and all these other things. And then that opens up the level of trust. Every once in a while, he might send a song that he just made on SoundCloud. And I just listen to it and I deeply understand it. And then we don't have to talk about it. But now I know that much more about him. So this also just understanding how people want to communicate and how they express themselves has been like a big lesson for me, even with my own blood. So
yeah, that's helpful to hear.
100%.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We're really glad to have spent the time with you and Jerome.
Much appreciated. Y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much, Jerome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Oh,
you.
we
Thank
are
you so
recording this.
much.
Do you want to, we're recording this and we'll put it up onto the YouTube channel if you missed the opening beginning or anything like that.
Nobody wants to leave.
That means I did my job. This is love. I appreciate you.